Welcome to the Investigation Guru, where real-life PIs Sean and Dana bring you to the darker side of true crime investigations. Stories so horrific, it's hard to believe they actually happened. But truth is often darker than fiction. Real life can sometimes involve lies, betrayal, abduction, and even torture and death. These stories will take you on a journey through some of the world's darkest and most notorious true crime investigations. The Investigation Guru starts now. Here's Sean and Dana.
Hello, and welcome to the Investigation Guru podcast. This is the official podcast for Red Door Investigations. My name is Sean, and today we're going to be talking about the case of Jim Jones and the murder and massacre at Jonestown. Now, it's commonly believed that a lot of his followers, or I guess the ones that died at Jonestown, they committed suicide. But I don't think that is really the case. I think Jim Jones actually murdered all of those people. We're going to talk about some of Jones's personality and why he was able to get all of these people to follow him, what it was about the church, if you really even want to call it that. It wasn't really... It started out as a religious organization, but I think later on it kind of morphed more into a political organization. We're going to talk about a lot of his political beliefs and his beliefs in communism and socialism and things like that. But really, the main focus of today is going to be discussing exactly the events that led up to this horrible event and how Jones was able to manipulate, and how he was able to get all of these people to willfully and almost happily kill themselves based on his word alone. So it's a very, very interesting case. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this. Again, this is a big one that has a lot of coverage. It took quite a while to research all of this and get all of these facts straight, because there is quite a bit of conjecture out there and quite a bit of opinion. And kind of weeding through a lot of that and making sure that this episode did this subject matter justice. I don't want to gloss over any of the things that happened, but I also don't want to dwell on solely the event that happened on that day. So we're going to talk about the life of Jim Jones and a little bit about again what pushed him and what motivated him to do what he did, where he came from, his family life. And also kind of the ecology and the environment of what it was actually like inside that church and what the members experienced, because it was not your normal, average, everyday church. Again, I mentioned before that this was really more of kind of a political organization. I would think they organized marches, and Jim Jones was he actually held public office there for a little while. So he was really, really involved in politics. We're going to talk about his political affiliations and his work with the mayor's office of San Francisco and things like that. So the idea that this was a religious organization, I think Jim Jones had kind of a religious background, and really that's kind of the way that he wanted to approach this, but it warped itself. And he began using it as a means of controlling people, and began using it as a way to exert a lot of influence over people's lives, because religion is a very, very powerful influencing motive in many people's lives. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. James Warren Jones was born on May 13th, 1931 in Crete, Indiana, to James Thurman Jones, a World War I veteran, and Lynetta Putnam. His father, Jones, described his father as not a very nice man. He was a drunk. He had a very, very bad drinking problem, and a lot of people think that this was the result of injuries he might have sustained in the war. But again, we're not really exactly sure. We think, maybe he was just not up to everyday life, and that's kind of how a lot of people who have drinking problems tend to cope with the stresses. And so Jim Jones Sr. was not really very involved in Jim Jones's life. He was present, but again, he was really neglectful and really Although he was physically there, he wasn't really emotionally there at all. He was a racist, and he was actually even rumored to have been a member of the KKK, which had the KKK was very, very popular in Depression era Indiana, where Jim Jones grew up. Jones recounted how he and his father would regularly fight and argue on the issue of race. Both of them were, again, very, very set in their ways. Jim Jones Sr. was really just kind of an asshole. Again, being a member of, or reportedly, allegedly, being a member of the KKK, it's not a secret what his views of race relations were like. This is not a progressive era in terms of race relations. This was the 1930s, 1940s in the Midwest. So race relations were not, they probably weren't as bad as they were maybe down in the South, but he claimed that he did not speak with his father for many, many years after his father refused to allow one of Jones's black friends into his house. Now, this may have been much of the fuel for Jones's later views on race relations and why he was such a big, huge proponent of integration. That was one of the fundamental tenets of the People's Temple Church, was that it was going to be all-inclusive. And this really got him a lot of ire and a lot of disdain from the community. And it eventually caused him to flee Indiana and head to California. So Jim Jones was really, for all the bad things that he did, he was really very progressive and really ahead of his time when it came to race relations. And it was very, very important to him that his congregation be completely mixed and not segregated at all. He had a real big problem with the current views of the time that had such a foundation and such a basis in racial segregation. His family experienced severe financial hardships and moved to the nearby town of Lynn, Indiana, in 1934 due to difficulties experienced by his family during the Great Depression. The Great Depression, again, it just seemed to be one thing after another. His father was out of work for most, if not all, of Jim Jones's life. Again, he had a very bad drinking problem, so his father was really not much of a figure in Jim's life, or in the family. He was pretty much emotionally and mentally checked out. So his mother did a great deal of the raising of Jim, and again, it's the Depression. Things are not good socially and financially. So the Jones family did the best they could. They lived in a rundown shack without any electricity or running water. And Jones, actually, looking back on his childhood later on in his life, he described these conditions as causing him, quote, a great deal of pain, because life was just so hard and his father was so absent and just so mean. He berated Jones and belittled him regularly, just not a very nice drunk at all. And Jones would later use this as a means of kind of identifying with his poorer congregants. And again, he really wanted to stress that his congregation was not going to be one of these big, huge elite churches. This was a church of the people, and he had a very socialistic, even borderline communist viewpoint of where he thought society should be. And one of those is that desegregation was mandatory. He was really, really big on wanting to make this as open of a community as he possibly could. And he attracted a lot. This message resonated with a lot of people, the poor people especially, and of course, minorities, African Americans, really flocked to Jones, because this was one of the few white churches, white ministers who would really have a great deal of pull for a lot of the African American community. So this was once he really got started, this congregation took off like wildfire. Jones was a voracious reader, and he studied various world communist and socialist leaders such as Stalin, Marx, Mao Zedong, Gandhi, and even Hitler, who he reportedly researched as a means of learning how to control a crowd, manipulate members of his congregation, and make them subservient to him. So really, it was this was almost a means to an end. And again, although Jones had a great deal of religious insight into how he viewed the world, the church in and of itself really was more of a social statement. And he really enjoyed learning from these people who were able to manipulate and control, and who were able to fire up a crowd, like Hitler and Stalin and all these people who could work a crowd into a frenzy, and he really fundamentally, he wanted to be adored. He wanted to be looked upon as a great person and an insightful man, and someone who really was able to influence people and who could really carry out this fervor of what he deemed to be of his message. He had a very, very lonely childhood, and when he was still a young man, he looked for ways to escape this loneliness and the misery that he experienced. Again, his family life was just horrendous, and so he would look for ways to really kind of escape. His childhood acquaintances would later describe him as a, quote, really weird kid. He apparently kind of stood out as someone who did not behave according to the norms of the day. Consequently, he had difficulty relating to other children, and he spent a great deal of time alone and turned to religion as a means of connecting with other people. He became obsessed with religion and death, and people allegedly said that he frequently held funerals for small animals on his parents' property, and that he even stabbed a cat to death so that he could have a funeral for it. And of course, when he had these funerals, he would invite all of his classmates to kind of observe him standing up in front of them and speaking. And this, again, is really where he kind of got comfortable in front of a crowd. I think that even at this early age, he was very, very interested in being able to manipulate people and have people view him as someone who was great. Jones's parents separated, and Jones relocated with his mother to Richmond, Indiana. So he moved again. He was a very good student and graduated from Richmond High School in December of 1948 early and with honors. After graduation, Jones took a job as an orderly at Richmond's Reed Hospital, and his bosses there held him in very, very high regard. They, he was a very good worker, and they really enjoyed having him on the staff. However, fellow staff members later recalled that Jones would oftentimes exhibit, quote, disturbing behavior. So again, this kind of odd behavior would begin to manifest, and it was really off-putting to quite a few people. And a lot of people looked at him with a great deal of suspicion, because the way that he looked at people and the way that he spoke to people, some of the things that he did was very, very odd, was very, very weird, and it gradually became much more intense. One former coworker even recalled an incident where Jones manhandled a patient in traction while shaving him, resulting in the patient's injury with a straight razor, and then giving a menacing look to the coworker. So the coworker kind of walked in on Jim Jones shaving a patient at this hospital that he was in charge of, and he was apparently getting quite physical and perhaps even violent with this patient. And when this coworker walked in and caught him, Jim turned around and gave this coworker a very, very dark, very, very menacing, very, very aggressive look, and really kind of disturbed this coworker. One thing that did come out of his time at the hospital was that he met Nurse Marceline Baldwin, who would later become his wife in 1949. And they would remain married to each other until both of their deaths at Jonestown, founding of the People's Temple. When Jones was 20 years old, he began attending gatherings of the Communist Party USA in Indianapolis. He was very interested in communist and socialist ideas, which stemmed from his readings of Marx and others as a teenager. He became frustrated with the persecution of accused communists, especially Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Jones would often ask himself, he would kind of look around at where society was at that day, and Jones asked himself, how can I demonstrate my Marxism? And the thought was, again, to infiltrate the church, to make sure that you can get your message out. And the church, again, was a very, very strong vehicle for attracting an audience. And so once he had the audience, he kind of, again, made this pivot and made this shift from discussing religious topics to really kind of discussing more social and political philosophies that he held. So that's exactly what he decided to do. He was actually surprised when a Methodist district superintendent offered to train him and give him kind of this chance on preaching. He really kind of gave him his big break. And in 1952, he became a student pastor at the Somerset Southside Methodist Church. He later left that church because they would not let him integrate blacks into his congregation. So again, Jones being very, very firm and very, very resilient in his desire to have a completely integrated and a completely all-inclusive congregation. The people that were training him The people that were, kind of giving him this opportunity, giving him his big break, they did not want that in their church. So Jones bolted. He didn't want any part of that at all. And again, he was really kind of ahead of his time on this, and this was not a popular opinion of the day by any means. So he was really standing up for what he believed in, which again was, one of the few good things that he really did. Jones took it upon himself to organize this huge kind of religious convention that was set to take place between June 11th and 15th of 1956. And it was there that he was able to kind of form and begin his own church. So he had gotten his feet wet, and he had kind of discovered that he had the talent, he had the goods to speak in front of people, and people were responding. And so he decided to, once he left that kind of student preacher position, he decided to go out and really give it a shot and see if he had the goods to attract a congregation. In deciding what to call his church, he actually went through several names before he finally decided on People's Temple Christian Church Full Gospel. And that was what he called his church. And he, of course, later shortened it to just People's Temple. He was ordained as a minister officially in 1957 by the Independent Assemblies of God, and in 1964 by the Disciples of Christ. So it became official. He was a full-fledged ordained minister. And now he was able to kind of go out and do whatever he wanted. Around 1960, Jones began to get involved in local Indianapolis politics. So, I told you that he was really more of a politician than a preacher, I would think. And getting people to like him and getting people to respond to his message was really the driving force in why he did all of this. All of the church and all of the healings and, the preaching, that was all just smoke and mirrors to really kind of serve his main ulterior motive, which was to manipulate people, and which was to get people to follow him, and which was to get people to view him as a influencing power. He was appointed director of the local Human Rights Commission by the mayor of Indianapolis. And in this new political position, Jones found a way to get his message of desegregation out to the public on local radio and television programs. So again, this message of desegregation, he was just hammering this home over and over and over again. It was really, really, really important to him. Jones began helping to racially integrate various institutions, including churches, restaurants, the telephone company, the police department, a theater, an amusement park, and even the Indiana University Health Methodist Hospital. When swastikas were painted on the homes of 2 local black families, Jones walked through the neighborhood and comforted the local black communities and counseled white families not to move, to keep it there and not really go anywhere. That, though at that time, the white families held a lot of influence and a lot more privilege and I guess authority and power than did the black families. But seeing this was, I guess the modern day version of burning crosses. In the face of all that intimidation, Jim Jones took it upon himself to walk his ass right out there and make sure that the black families there knew that they weren't alone, and knew that they were they had a place, and their place was with him. And he also spoke to a lot of the white families and asked them, please don't leave. You add, I guess, legitimacy to this area. And again, this was the 50s, so the times, they were much different than they were today. He also even set up sting operations to catch restaurants who refused to serve black customers. So he would try to get out there and expose people who wouldn't do what he felt was right. Jones received considerable criticism in Indiana from his integrationist views, and white-owned businesses were very, very critical of him. Again, this was not a popular opinion that Jones held, and he was really kind of a trailblazer in race relations. And I don't know how much you want to credit Jones for actually bringing about some social change, but I think that he played at least some part, and he did what he could to really bring this about. And again, this was of course one of the few things that he did that were good or pro-social, but he really was a big proponent of this desegregation and this anti-race division. When a swastika was placed on the temple building itself, and a stick of dynamite was left in a temple coal pile, and a dead cat was thrown at Jones's house after receiving a threatening phone call. However, none of this fazed him. He just kept doing exactly what he was going to do, and he was not going to be intimidated. He was not going to be threatened. He was not going to be stopped. And this was just really his mission going forward. And so they, again, the powers that be in the area did not like his message, and so they tried to really intimidate him, and they tried to really shut him down. And he had a big target on his back. But try as they might, they did not dissuade him one lick. In addition to their own biological son, whose name was Stephen, who was born in June of 1959, Jones and his wife adopted actually several non-white children. He referred to his household as kind of his rainbow family because there were many different colors. He further stated that, quote, "Integration is a more personal thing with me now. It is a question of my son's future," end quote. He also implemented this in the temple and began also referring to his congregation as his rainbow family. In 1961, they became the first white couple in Indiana to adopt a black child, and they named him Jim Jones Jr. They also adopted a white son, originally named Timothy Glenn Tupper, whose birth mother was a member of the church. They also adopted a Native American girl and 3 Korean American children, which gave them a total of 7 children, 1 biological and 6 adopted. Kicking off his paranoia and conspiracy theory beliefs, Jim later in his life really became very, very paranoid. As much of these cult leaders and really public figures tend to do, he started, believing in a lot of these conspiracy theories and a lot of, ideas that people were after him and he was being targeted, which, judging from where he came from, that's a pretty valid conclusion. But I think he kind of took it to a higher degree and started thinking that, a lot of the government was constantly after him and they were spying on him and things like that. So in light of kind of these beliefs and these ideas that started to really manifest themselves, Jones told his Indiana congregation that, quote, "The world will be engulfed by nuclear war on July 15th, 1967. So we have the check off the doomsday prediction mark on your bingo card of cult. And there we go. So he predicted that the world would end on June 15, 1967, and that it would end by nuclear war. He said that this would lead to a new socialist Eden on Earth, and that the only place they would be safe was in Northern California. He'd apparently read in an episode of Esquire that Redwood, California was a very, very safe and progressive area of the country. And so that's exactly what he decided to do. And he picked up and he bought a whole bunch of old Greyhound buses, packed up all of his congregation members, those who would come with him, which was a great many of them. And they drove across the country to Redwood Valley, California, which was near the city of Ukiah. Jones also taught that, quote, "Those who remained drugged with the opiate of religion had to be brought to enlightenment, socialism," end quote. He would infuse his sermons with his socialist and Marxist beliefs, and once preached that, quote, "If you're born in capitalist America, racist America, fascist America, then you're born in sin. But if you're born in socialism, you're not born in sin," end quote. And again, these socialist beliefs were very, very conducive to his desegregation and social movement that he really wanted to see come about in America. And this is really when, again, the message of the church, his sermons began to take on more of this political stint and how he viewed the world. And a lot of his conspiracy theories started trickling in. And when he thought that, there was always someone out there who was going to come and try and stop their message and stop their progressive movement. And, he was always a target, and they were always just on the outside, just about to come get us. And they had to remain hyper vigilant, and they really had to, keep going and maintain this strong front and really make sure that, they, if they slacked off, or if they backed off, or, if they stopped doing what they were doing, then they would be overtaken and that would be the end. But he really wanted to push this Marxist, communist, socialist ideal that he thought that the world really needed, and he thought that he was going to try to make the world a better place by pushing these ideas onto his growing, almost exponentially growing congregation. He even began deriding Christianity itself as a, quote, fly-away religion. So he was really, again, starting to, pull himself back from preaching in the normal sense of the word, and more of a politician, speaking to his people. He rejected the Bible as being a tool to oppress women and non-whites, and denouncing a, quote, sky god who was no god at all. He even went so far as to toss the Bible to the ground and daring God to strike him down right then and there. And he made this big to-do, this big charade, and he took his Bible up on the pulpit, and he tossed it out into the middle of the congregation, and it landed, boom, on the ground, and almost kind of taunted God to strike him down, because this book has been keeping his people of color down for centuries, and it held no power and all of this type of thing, and asking, did you just see lightning come out of the sky and strike me down? And of course it didn't, but this was really, really shocking, and this got a whole lot of people's attention. And when he did this, the whole room was just kind of dead quiet. It was a very, very theatrical, very, very effective tool, effective message. And of course, taunting and tempting God and all of this, for people who are religious, this is a very big no-no. Tempting God is almost tantamount to sacrilege or blasphemy. And you should not ever tempt God or taunt God. That is not something that smart people do. And so Jones was really, really pushing the edge of even Christianity, of Christian views, and the ability to send his message out there was really, really what started out as a very something that was rooted or based in Christianity and religion, made that switch, made that transition very, very dramatically. And even though this was something that Christians, held very, very dearly, don't tempt God, don't taunt God, Jones did it proudly and used it as a means to show that he was kind of above rebuke and that God was an illusion. And this is when he really started to preach blasphemy. God didn't exist, and God was, a made-up social construct that was used as a tool by the elite to, keep the everyday man ground down. That God was, this quote sky god, and that that God doesn't exist, and he was simply just a tool that was used in an effort to control other people. And he kept it up. He began preaching that he was the reincarnation of Gandhi, Jesus, Buddha, and even Lenin. This is, again, once he had all of these people kind of roped in and really baited on his hook, he really took it to the extreme and started going out in left field. And it really, really became a show almost, just this circus of what all this guy was going to say next. He was quoted as saying, quote, "Some people see a great deal of God in my body. They see Christ in me, a hope of glory," end quote. He said another time, quote, "What you need to believe in is what you can see. If you see me as your friend, I'll be your friend. As you see me as your father, I'll be your father, for those of you who don't have a father. If you see me as your savior, I'll be your savior. If you see me as your God, I'll be your God," end quote. And again, he said, quote, "You're going to help yourself or you'll get no help. There's only one hope of glory, and that's within you. Nobody's going to come out of the sky. There's no heaven up there. We'll have to make heaven down here," end quote. And once Jones had moved this temple to California, numbers climbed exponentially, and the new branches began opening in cities including San Francisco, San Fernando, and Los Angeles. So he was really, really gaining a following. This idea of social reconstructionism and this idea of socialism and desegregation, this really, really resonated with a whole bunch of people, and people really began to respond. He eventually moved the temple's headquarters to San Francisco, which was a major center for radical protest movements. And he would, quote, rent out temple members for protests. If someone needed a bunch of people to protest anything that Jones agreed with, then he would send hundreds of temple members to chant and carry signs. This was kind of that day's version of crowds on demand. And, if you needed someone to protest or shout out or do anything like that, he would send you out a couple hundred temple members. And, they were polite. They were on time. And they did what they were supposed to do. And that was it. So again, he really started to curry favor with a lot of people in that city. He continued his influence in politics, helping to elect George Moscone as mayor of San Francisco in 1975. Moscone subsequently appointed James as the chairman of the San Francisco Housing Authority Commission. So now Jones had his first public office. Jones was able to gain contact with prominent politicians at the local and the national level. He held meetings with Walter Mondale, and even First Lady Rosalind Carter gave him an audience. Jones gained a lot of attention and notoriety during this time, and the temple membership again skyrocketed exponentially. Along with his notoriety came a great deal of scrutiny. There began to be rumors circling that Jones and the temple were not all that they seemed to be. Two reporters for the San Francisco Chronicle, Marshall Kilduff and Phil Tracy, wrote a scathing article on the People's Temple that included allegations by temple defectors of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. I'll put a copy of this article in the show notes, so you'll be able to look over that and read that at your leisure. When Jones heard about this article and what it might do to his image and reputation within the community, Jones and several hundred followers abruptly decided to move to a compound they had built in Guyana, which is a country in South America. They officially called this area the People's Temple Agricultural Product, but it was informally known as Jonestown. The formation and operation of Jonestown. Jones started building Jonestown several years before the Kilduff article was even published. He started to feel the social and political pressure, the scrutiny being placed on him based on a lot of reports that had started coming out of abuse and allegations and things like that of actually what was going on inside the church. He would hold really beatings, and it was kind of a little fight club, if you will. If anyone had misbehaved or anything, they would be called up to the front and they would have to fight each other and literally fist fight. And Jones would sit up there and kind of look over his sunglasses and watch with interest. And he was always kind of he had a big smile on his face. He really, really enjoyed these public displays. There was even talk of him, sexually abusing or even raping many of the men and women in the church. So there was a lot of talk of sexual misconduct. He would hold little, disciplinary hearings where a lot of the church members would get together, and he would call up perhaps a female and ask her to completely, take all of her clothes off. He would sit there and, mock her body and talk about all of the things that were wrong, her breasts and her stomach and her legs and all of the things where she, he felt that she fell short. And so a lot of these reports, it didn't take long for a lot of these things to really get out, that a lot of this behavior was inappropriate, to say the least, and potentially even illegal. So he started to draw a lot of scrutiny and, legal attention on what he was allowing to happen in his church. So he took that and he decided several years before the actual move that he wanted to get the hell out of Dodge. And so he started researching areas to take the church, and he settled on Guyana in South America. He promoted Jonestown as a means to create both a socialist paradise and a sanctuary from the media scrutiny in San Francisco. Jones purported to establish it as a model communist community, adding that the temple comprised, quote, the purest communists there are, end quote. Jones did not permit members to leave the settlement, so he took a small group at first down there and had them start building. And once they were down there, he did not want them to leave. And this will come up again later on when we talk about the final days. And this was, again, a very, very common norm or rule in a lot of cultist type of environments. He started to cut them off from their family and started to remove them from any kind of news of the outside world. So they were very, very insulated community, and really kind of the only means of outside communication, the only news that they had of the outside was from Jones himself. So he really controlled every single aspect of their lives, and they were completely insulated and really just lived the community, lived, breathed. They weren't allowed to talk on the phone. They weren't allowed to watch television, listen to the radio, anything like that. And all of their news or information came from Jones himself. They were forced to give up their passports, and they worked 18 to 20 hours a day, just literally working all the time, trying to get this project ready and get this area ready for the 900 people that would later come down. They were completely self-contained and self-reliant, so they had everything they needed. They produced everything that they needed. All of their food, all of their clothing, all of their medical care, everything was taken care of right there at the site. So he had doctors, he had nurses, he had people who could farm, he had people who could, build, the structures and actually, create the buildings and things like that. Carpenters and engineers and those types of individuals. So they needed no outside help whatsoever. And they were completely able to, sustain themselves. They needed nothing from the outside world, and they provided everything they needed for themselves. They were truly, on their own and completely isolated. In the compound, there was also a speaker system where Jones could make announcements to the entire community. And of course, only Jones was allowed to use it, and he used it day and night to spread his conspiracy theories about the corrupt nature of the U.S. and how the temple was a target. The temple was always a target. Everyone was always out to get them. And he knew that, he kind of saw the writing on the wall and knew that this was, he was starting to draw some unwanted attention. Jones began to propagate his belief in what he termed translation once his followers settled in Jonestown, claiming that he and his followers would all die together, move to another planet, and live blissfully. So check off another box on your weird cult behavior bingo card. He talked about these things constantly over the loudspeaker. It was just, no matter where you were in the compound, you could hear it all the time. He went day and night. When he was talking to them when they were falling asleep, he was talking to them when they got up in the morning, he was talking to them when they worked, he was talking to them when they ate. It was just always constant Jim Jones in their ear. And he was, again, the only voice of, or the only source of any kind of outside news or any kind of information that they got. They weren't allowed to, watch television or contact any of the members or anything outside of the area itself. And back in the States, the pressure again was really heating up. They began to get word that he was trying to escape and start building this kind of fundamentalist area down in South America, and taking a lot of American citizens with him. And the family members of temple members were really starting to become very, very concerned, because a lot of their family members were deciding to leave and go over there with him and kind of start this new life. And they were starting to wonder and worry if they would even ever see or hear from their family members again. Jones began to draw increasing scrutiny from the public and from concerned family members who claimed to have received reports from former temple members who escaped, like Deborah Layton, who provided an affidavit detailing crimes by the temple and substandard living conditions at Jonestown. In November of 1978, Congressman Leo Ryan led a fact-finding mission to Jonestown to investigate allegations of human rights abuses. His delegation included relatives of temple members, an NBC camera crew, and reporters from various newspapers. This group arrived in the Guyanese capital of Georgetown on November 15th, and 2 days later they were transported to Jonestown in a tractor transporter. Jones held a reception for the delegation that evening at the Central Pavilion in Jonestown, and it was really kind of a big, huge celebration and a party. And he wanted to kind of send off the image that everyone was happy there, and everything was going great, and they were singing and dancing, and everyone was laughing, and they had a big, huge feast, and just really kind of rolling out the red carpet for this congressman who had come down there to really look at what was going on, because he had received word that a lot of bad things were going on. And Congressman Ryan was kind of those fringe congressmen who really kind of made a name for himself by doing a lot of things that a lot of other politicians might not do. For instance, he, in order to kind of investigate prison reform and prison justice, he actually locked himself in a prison. But I believe it was for something like 8 days. And he lived the life of a prisoner to really kind of get a firsthand account of what was going on, so that he could really make some informed decisions. And so he was really more of kind of a hands-on type of politician, not something that we really have much of today. but he was really kind of one of those guys that wanted to get his hands dirty and make sure that, he wanted to experience things firsthand. Congressman Ryan made a speech during this ceremony praising Jones and saying that, quote, "The few members that I have spoken with say that this is the best thing that ever happened to them," end quote. And this, of course, received thunderous applause from the members who were there. And a lot of the group that was with Ryan kind of thought that this was a little bit rehearsed and manufactured and seemed not genuine, that it was over the top. The delegation members felt that this performance had been rehearsed and that it was not a true reflection of the conditions in the camp, that they had been almost coerced into this performance, that everything was wonderful and everything was grand and everyone was so happy and ecstatic to be there. And it was, the best thing that ever happened to them. During the reception celebration, Temple member Vernon Gosney actually passed a note meant for Ryan to NBC reporter Don Harris, requesting assistance for himself and another Temple member, Monica Bagby, in leaving the settlement. So he kind of pulled one of them, by the arm and handed them a note, secretly handed them a note saying, "We want to leave. We do not want this. This is not how things really are." And this was again the first sign to any of the delegation members that things were not what they seemed on the surface, that this was indeed a prison. So they began, once they'd kind of gotten this information, they began interviewing other Temple members, asking if they wanted to leave, and several more, finally admitted that they did. And of course, Jones is over there freaking out that, a lot of his congregation is wanting to leave, and the house of cards is starting to come down all around him. And he kind of sees the writing on the wall again, that this is not going to last. This is, the end is coming. When Jones was confronted about the note, he pleaded with the congressman and his delegation to leave the camp and to just, quote, "let us be," claiming that people lie, meaning Gosney, the guy who had passed the note. Gosney's son was there and everything, and Jones kind of made the argument that, if it's so bad here, why is he letting his son stay? To kind of, again, throw off the idea that, things really were that bad, and there were actually people who wanted to leave and didn't want to stay, which of course, incensed Jones, and he really took this as a personal attack and a personal affront, much like, other cult leaders do. The worst thing you can possibly do is express a desire to leave. However, in the background, while all of this is going on, and the congressman and everybody was really distracted trying to get to the bottom of this and find out, who wanted to leave and what was actually happening and what was going on. It started to kind of become a little bit chaotic, and people started to scream and cry and beg to leave. Once once that first impetus was knocked down, then the floodgates kind of opened and everyone started to express these desires to leave. And they didn't want to stay here. They were here against their will, and they were essentially being held prisoner while all this was going on. And then this chaotic nature, Jones's thugs, his guards, began to prepare for more drastic measures, which were probably on the orders of Jones himself. So he began to, again, the house of cards is coming down and things are starting to really get bad. And so Jones may have ordered his guards to, go grab their weapons and prepare for armed altercation if it came down to that. And so a lot of the armed guards began to take position in a perimeter around the pavilion and carrying, holding machine guns. This again really began to set the tone of what was about to happen. Jones was prepared to take this all the way to the end. Ryan's delegation, of course, left in a hurry. The afternoon of November 18th, after Temple member Don Sly attacked the congressman with a knife. The attack was thwarted by Ryan's security team. So they actually attempted to assassinate Congressman Leo Ryan. Once that happened, that was it. It was done. The congressman and his delegation team took off with, I believe it was 5 or 6 Temple members who wanted to leave, and they were gonna close the hammer. Probably send the military, perhaps. So once this happened, Jones became very, very erratic and very, very. It became obvious that this charade could not go on any longer. Ryan and his delegation managed to take on 15 Temple members who had expressed a wish to leave, and Jones made no further attempt to prevent their departure at that time. They made it all the way to the airstrip before things became much worse. In his desperation, Jones had sent armed guards to the airstrip to prevent the congressman and, more importantly, the members from leaving, which led to the Port Kaituma airstrip shootings. As members of Orion's delegation boarded 2 planes at the Port Kaituma airstrip outside of the compound, Jones's armed guards, called the Red Brigade, arrived on a tractor and trailer and began shooting at them. When this vehicle first approached, the gunmen were laying down in the back, hiding from view. So it was kind of like a small little tractor trailer. It looked like the bed of a pickup, and they were lying down flat, hiding in the back from the delegation itself. And when they got there, they kind of pulled alongside and blocked access to the airplane. And once they parked, the temple or the guards who were in the back laying down with the machine guns, they got up and started shooting. The gunman killed Congressman Ryan and 4 others. One of the supposed defectors, Larry Layton, drew a weapon and began firing on members of the party from inside the other plane. So he was kind of a plant. He pretended that he wanted to leave, but he was actually given a gun and was told to, when the time is right, to start shooting from the plane. And so what the delegation thought was a member who wanted to leave and that they were actually trying to save was actually another guard. NBC cameraman Bob Brown was able to capture footage of the first few seconds of the shooting as he lay on the ground behind a tire. And he was killed in that position, which, again, was marked by an abrupt end to that footage. And you can see that tape on YouTube. And the camera's kind of positioned behind one of the airplane tires. And just like that, it goes to static. 5 people were killed on the airstrip that day. Surviving the attack were future Congresswoman Jackie Spear, who was a Ryan staff member, Richard Dwyer, Bob Flick, Steve Sung, Tim Reiterman, Ron Cavers, Charles Krause, and several defecting temple members. And again, this kind of marked the point of no return. They had killed a United States congressman, and it was going to. And once news of this got out, they would probably send the military. The United States would send the military down to bring back the people who wanted to leave and kind of initiate a rescue mission. Mass murder-suicide in Jonestown. Jones's prior statements that hostile forces would convert captured children to fascism would lead many members who strongly believed in the temple's leftist ideology to view the supposed suicide as valid. All of his talk about the outside world coming in to take them now had real validity. And he kind of spun this congressman visit as a means for them to check them out and investigate and to come and get them, and they're on their way now. It's inevitable. We are going to be shut down. They're going to kill us all. With that reasoning, Jones and several members argued that the group should commit, quote, revolutionary suicide by drinking cyanide-laced grape-flavored Flavor Aid along with a sedative. So to kind of curtail them being captured and being tortured. And, they're going to torture our children. They're going to torture our seniors. They're going to torture us and kill us. And he didn't want any of that. So he began kind of spinning this idea that, they're on their way. They're going to come get us. We're not going to give them the satisfaction. We're not going to give them the ability to control when we die. We're going to have control over our own destiny and all of this type of talk. And again, he was on the loudspeaker constantly preaching about, not really preaching, but constantly sending this message that, we need to be in control. We need to take control back. This is the only way that we can win. Jones had taken large shipments of cyanide into Jonestown for several years prior to November 1978, having obtained a jeweler's license that would allow him to purchase the compound in bulk to purportedly clean gold. So he had planned this for several years. This wasn't a spontaneous act. This wasn't revolutionary. It was premeditated murder. He had this cyanide and he had began ordering it years ago. So, he was kind of hoarding this and keeping this on site for this particular day. So he had been planning this for quite some time. On November 18th, 1979, 909 inhabitants of Jonestown, 206 of whom were children, died of apparent cyanide poisoning, mostly in and around the central pavilion. The children were given the Flavor Aid by their parents, and then the adults began to drink. Families were told to lie down together, and many did. Photos of the aftermath showed so many bodies, so much death. It's a very, very hard case to research, a very, very hard case to discuss. The pictures are even worse. Just a field of bodies, and many of them were just lying face down in the mud, frothing at the mouth. Just body after body after body, just a sea of senseless death. The FBI later recovered a 45-minute audio recording of the mass poisoning in progress. And again, you can listen to this from several different sources. It's available easily if you are interested in this and you want to hear what Jones was saying and, the kind of the events of that day. I don't know why you would, but it is out there for you if you want to hear it. I am not going to play it on this podcast or I'm not going to post it on the show notes or on the website or anything. But if you are interested, it is definitely out there. It's a tough listen, but I think it's important that it be heard. But I want to warn you that it is not a pleasant experience, especially knowing what all went down and what happened while that tape was going on. The reason given by Jones to commit suicide was, again, this consistent, previously stated conspiracy theory that intelligence organizations were allegedly conspiring against the temple. He began, he was very, very paranoid. He was on drugs. He began taking a lot of drugs back when they were still in California, and that the military was going to come in here and quote parachute in here on us, and he was really convinced that they were going to invade him, and he was probably right. Once the congressman's visit happened and everything that went down on the airstrip, yeah, that was probably a pretty fair assumption. But again, he consistently held these beliefs that they were a target and they were going to be tortured and going to be captured and all of these things. They were going to be overtaken, and that's just kind of how he really, again, maintained a great deal of control. And that is, with them being completely isolated and not able to get any kind of independent news. Everything they heard, everything they knew about the outside world, from the point that they got there until the point that they died, came from Jones. And he was the only voice that they heard, and whatever he told them began to, again, kind of brainwash. And, they began to see him as the one true source of truth. And his interpretations were warped and probably likely not very accurate. But what he told them and how he managed to continuously ingrain in them that they were a target and they were consistently going to, the threats were always just outside, and they were always trying to reach in, and it was just a matter of time, and they're right around the corner. And this sense of urgency was very, very important. This sense of this was impending, and they didn't have much time, and everything was, especially on that day, when all of this was going. And Jones can be heard saying over and over again, "Hurry, hurry, hurry! Don't think about it. Don't worry. Just do it." One temple member, Christine Miller, began to express her reservations toward the beginning of the tape. She kind of stood up and said, "Why do we have to do this? Why do we have to kill ourselves? There's no reason for this." And, Jones had been talking about going to Russia, about, possibly relocating to communist Russia and taking the temple over there, because, again, that was kind of the seat of where his views were manifest. And so she brought up the idea, well, can we still not escape to Russia? Is that still on the table? Why do we have to kill ourselves? Why do we have to end this like this? And Jones continued to play off that Russia no longer wanted us, and Russia turned us down. That's no longer an option. We need to do this so that we aren't taken prisoner. We're not taken captive. And again, this idea of hurrying and pushing, and always, everything had to be rushed. And, he didn't want them to think about that. And he just wanted them to And you have to kind of understand that they are completely insulated, that they have had no contact with loved ones or anyone outside of the group itself. And a lot of people, don't understand this about cult psychology, that the leader is viewed as a god. The leader is viewed as perfect, and they tend to take the word of the leader as the word of God, that he is somehow, whether it's an interpreter or whether he speaks for God or he has the ear of God. That's a very, very common thread and very, very common theme in these types of cult behaviors. And so Jones, even said, if you see me as your God, then I will be your God. And so that was a constant permeating message. And the fact that this was all that they heard over and over and over again, it really ingrained in their psychology, and it really took over their ability to think for themselves. And that is a very, very important factor and facet to kind of understand how this was able to happen. And then, the Jonestown massacre has been studied time and time again. When we look at cults and when we try to examine how this can possibly happen and how someone can convince other people to kill themselves, and this is not the only instance of that. Heaven's Gate cult and others have come down the pike that have purported to commit suicide on the command of their leader. But this idea that, someone finally standing up and questioning really upset Jones. When other members kind of started in and began crying and wailing, Jones counsel, stop these hysterics. This is not the way for people who are socialists or communists to die. No way for us to die. We must die with some dignity. Don't be afraid to die. Death is just stepping over into another plane. And he continued to hammer this home over and over and over again. Jones's wife, Marceline, apparently protested to killing the children. She wanted to maybe we should let the children live. When she said that, she was forcibly restrained and then joined the others in poisoning herself. Tim Carter, a temple member who escaped into the woods during the tragedy, summed it up pretty perfectly. And pardon the language here, but this is a quote. He said, quote, "We were just fucking slaughtered. Fucking slaughtered. There was nothing dignified about it. Had nothing to do with a revolutionary suicide, nothing to do with making a fucking statement. It was just senseless waste and death." End quote. At the end of the tape, Jones concludes, quote, "We didn't commit suicide. We committed an act of revolutionary suicide, protesting the conditions of an inhumane world." End quote. This tragedy resulted in the greatest single loss of human civilian life in a deliberate act until the events of September 11th, 2001. Following the mass murder-suicide of all of his congregation, Jones was found dead at the stage of the central pavilion. He was resting on a pillow near his deck chair with a gunshot wound to his right temple, which was, again, the coroners decided it was consistent with suicide. The autopsy on Jones's body confirmed that he died by suicide. The barbiturate pentobarbital was also found in his body at a level that would have been lethal were it not for his physiological tolerance. So he had been taking barbiturates for quite some time, and they found a lethal amount in his body that would have killed an ordinary person, but he had built up such a physiological tolerance that he was able to think and function. Once the FBI and the investigators, the Guyana police and things began to descend on the area, Jones's body was cremated and his ashes were scattered in the Atlantic Ocean. The letter. A letter written by a member who died that day and wished to remain anonymous was later recovered by investigators. Its contents are haunting even to this day. To whomever finds this note, collect all the tapes, all the writing, all the history. The story of this movement, this action, must be examined over and over. We did not want this kind of ending. We wanted to live, to shine, to bring light to a world that is dying for a little bit of love. There's quiet as we leave this world. The sky is gray. People file by us slowly and take the somewhat bitter drink. Many more must drink. A teeny kitten sits next to me watching. The dog barks. The birds gather on the telephone wires. Let all the story of this people's temple be told. If nobody understands, it matters not. I am ready to die now. Darkness settles over Jonestown on its last day on Earth. That is the story of Jim Jones in Jonestown. A very dark and sad time. A very dark and sad event. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for listening. I think we're going to start interspersing a few episodes dealing with missing persons. We're going to call them BOLO episodes. So I think starting next week, we might do at least maybe 1 or 2 episodes a week, discussing and kind of highlighting, 2 or 3 perhaps missing people. Just kind of be on the lookout. Get that information out there. Hopefully, maybe it'll be listened or heard by someone who knows some things. I don't know, but if you like that idea and think that that's something that we should do, leave a comment. Let me know. Anyway, thank you again so much for listening. This is the Investigation Guru. My name is Sean. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.
This has been the Investigation Guru, hosted by Sean and Dana. A presentation of Red Door Investigations in the DFW Metroplex of Texas, specializing in infidelity, fraud, child custody, missing persons, and more. Check out our website at reddoorinvestigations.com or on social media at RedDoorPI. For more fascinating deep dives into real true crime, subscribe to the show today. Many elements of an investigation have to remain secret, but not this podcast. Our best advertising has always been word of mouth, so please share the feed with a friend today. And if you'd like to support the show, we offer some goodies on our Patreon at patreon.com/INVGuruPod. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.